The dress was ivory, not white ivory. There was a difference, and Julie had learned that difference the hard way, standing in the narrow fitting room of a second-hand boutique in Mapogu, holding two fabrics up to the fluorescent light until she could feel it in her chest which one was right. Ivory was quieter. Ivory didn't announce itself. Ivory said, "I belong here, and I didn't need to shout about it." She had spent 3 weeks' worth of part-time cafe wages on alterations alone. The seamstress, a small woman in her 60s who worked out of a ground-floor unit near Hangik University, had looked at Julie with something between admiration and pity when she came in for the final fitting. She hadn't said anything. She had simply smoothed the fabric across Julie's shoulders with both palms slowly, the way you smooth a letter you're about to seal, and said, "You carry this well." Julie had smiled and said thank you in Korean. She always said thank you in Korean. That was the thing about Julie Akafer. She had arrived in Seoul 26 months earlier on a full academic scholarship from her university in Lagos, carrying 2 suitcases, a folder of documents, and a quiet, unshakable belief that if she worked hard enough, learned the language well enough, loved genuinely enough, the world would eventually make room for her. Not because the world owed her anything, but because that was simply how things were supposed to work. She stood now in front of the bathroom mirror of the small apartment she shared with Hyungwoo in secret, and she looked at herself for a long time. Her braids were pinned up, neat and deliberate. Her earrings, gold, small her mother's, caught the light. She had practiced her Korean greetings 4 times that morning. She had researched the Kang family's business holdings so she could speak intelligently if anyone asked. She had done everything a person could reasonably do to walk into a room and be taken seriously. All of this because tonight, Hyungwoo had promised. "Tonight I'll tell them about us. I'll introduce you properly. I promise you, Julie." He had said it 2 weeks ago, sitting across from her at their kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, looking at her with those eyes that always made her feel, against her better judgment, completely safe. She had searched his face for the familiar hesitation, the slight tension around his jaw that appeared whenever the subject of his family came up, and she hadn't found it. Or maybe she had found it and chosen not to see it. Love had a way of doing that. She heard his key in the door and turned away from the mirror. He walked in looking the way he always looked when he had come from his family's world, suit pressed, expression arranged into something careful and unreadable, the easy warmth he carried at home already folded away and tucked somewhere she couldn't reach. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that looked like pain. "You look beautiful," he said. "I know," she said, and picked up her clutch. The Kang mansion sat behind iron gates in a part of Seoul where the streets were wider and quieter than they had any natural right to be. The kind of quiet that wasn't the absence of noise but the presence of money, a bought, maintained, deliberate silence. Julie watched it through the car window as Hyungwoo drove, and she felt her heartbeat adjust itself to the architecture. High walls, manicured trees lit from below. A circular driveway where a man in a dark uniform was already parking a silver foreign car with plates she didn't recognize. "Are you nervous?" Hyungwoo asked without looking at her. "No," she said, which wasn't entirely true but was the truest version of herself she wanted to offer him right now. He nodded, his hand steady on the wheel. She wanted to reach over and touch his arm. She wanted to say, "I trust you, I chose you, don't make me regret it." But she had already said all those things in various ways over the past 2 years, and tonight was supposed to be the answer. So she stayed quiet and watched the gates open and let the car move forward. Inside, the house was everything the outside promised. Chandeliers that didn't try to be subtle, floors that reflected the light back at you. Guests moving through the main hall in the curated, unhurried way of people who had never once in their lives worried about whether they had been invited. The air smelled of something expensive, camellia, maybe, and sandalwood, and underneath it all the faint metallic scent of old wealth that Julie had no name for but recognized immediately. She walked in beside Hyungwoo, a staff member near the entrance, young, female, dressed in the household's dark uniform, looked up, and then looked at Julie with the specific expression of someone mentally sorting a person into a category. Her eyes traveled from Julie's braids to her ivory dress to the clutch in her hand, and then she said in Korean, quickly, almost gently, "Staff entrance is around the back." Julie stopped. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The correction formed cleanly in her mind, "I'm a guest. I am here with Kang Hyun-woo," and she was already drawing breath to say it when she heard footsteps behind her and felt the shift in the room's attention that meant Hyun-woo had arrived at her side. She turned to him, expecting the correction to come from him instead, expecting him to say, with the calm authority she had watched him use in business calls and family dinners described to her in second-hand stories, "She is with me." Hyun-woo looked at the staff member. Then he looked at Julie, and in the space between one breath and the next, he said, "She helps around the house." The words landed the way a glass lands on tile, not slowly, not with warning, just impact, then silence, then the sound of everything that had been whole a moment ago. Julie did not move. The staff member nodded and turned away, entirely satisfied, already moving on to the next thing. Somewhere behind them, a small group of guests shifted and murmured amongst themselves. The chandelier kept throwing light across the floor. The house kept smelling of camellia and sandalwood and old money. And Julie stood in the entrance of the Kang mansion in her ivory dress, in her mother's gold earrings, with her pinned braids and her practiced Korean greetings, and her 3 weeks of altar wages sewn into the seams of a moment that had just been taken from her by the one person she had trusted to protect it. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. She decided in those first few seconds to be still, not because she was weak, not because she didn't know what had just happened, but because Julie Okafor had grown up watching her mother navigate rooms that were not built for her, and her mother had taught her something that no scholarship, no language class, no amount of preparation could teach. The most powerful thing you can do in a room that has just tried to reduce you is refuse to be reduced. Not loudly. Not with tears or raised voices that would give everyone present the satisfaction of a scene. Simply refuse. Stay upright. Keep your face. So she kept her face. She followed Hyun-woo into the main hall, and when he moved toward a cluster of suited men near the far end of the room without looking back at her, she stopped walking and stood at the edge of the gathering and took it all in. The guests moved in that self-contained, practiced way of the ultra-wealthy at social functions, groups forming and dissolving with the fluid ease of people who had been navigating rooms like this since childhood. Women in structured kippaos and European couture. Men whose watches cost more than Julie's entire scholarship. Waitstaff moving between them like water, silent and efficient, carrying trays of champagne in tall flutes that caught the chandelier light and threw small rainbows onto the marble floor. And then Madame Kang appeared at the top of the staircase. Julie had never seen her in person, only in the photographs Hyun-woo had never offered, but that she had quietly found over 2 years of loving a man who kept his family in a sealed room inside himself. In photographs, Madame Kang was elegant in the distant, composed way of a woman who had long ago decided that warmth was a luxury she could not afford. In person, she was something more than that. She descended the staircase in a gown of deep charcoal silk, her silver hair arranged with architectural precision, and she moved through her own home the way royalty moves through a crowd, not parting it exactly, but somehow the crowd was always already parted before she arrived. Her eyes swept the room the way a general sweeps terrain. They landed on Julie. The pause was barely a second. Then Madame Kang was moving again, descending the final steps, extending both hands toward a silver-haired man in a dark suit, laughing at something he said. But in that 1 second, Julie had felt the assessment, complete, total, final, and understood that whatever verdict had been reached, it had nothing to do with who she actually was. It was 20 minutes later when Madame Kang found her near the drinks table. Julie had drifted there not because she wanted a drink, but because standing alone in the middle of the room had begun to feel more exposed than standing near something solid. She was holding a glass of mineral water and watching the room with the careful, absorptive attention she usually reserved for studying, when she heard Madame Kang's voice directly behind her. "You. The drinks need to be refreshed on the east table." Julie turned slowly. Madame Kang was looking at her with the polite, detached authority of a woman who had given instructions to staff her entire life and had never once doubted that they would be followed. There was no malice in it yet, just assumption, absolute, practiced, total assumption. Julie held her gaze for exactly 1 moment. Then she thought of Hyun-woo's voice in the entrance hall, "She helps around the house," and something inside her made a quiet, terrible decision, not to comply out of fear, but to stay and watch and understand exactly what she had walked into. She picked up the drinks tray. She told herself it was strategy. She told herself she was gathering information, staying close, waiting for Hyun-woo to come and correct this. She told herself a lot of things as she moved between the guests with a tray in her hands, her ivory dress indistinguishable now from the household staff's dark ones in the minds of everyone present, her mother's gold earrings still catching the light above a face that showed nothing. The conversations she moved through were not kind. Two women near the window were discussing the family's business expansion into Southeast Asia in a way that treated the people of those countries as scenery. A group of men near the fireplace were laughing about something in rapid Banmal Korean that Julie understood perfectly, a joke at the expense of a foreign colleague, the punchline hinging on an accent. And then, cutting cleanly through all of it, a woman's voice near the center table, bright and carrying and entirely unaware of or uninterested in who might be listening. At least the maid is pretty. Laughter. Soft, civilized, champagne-loosened laughter. Julie set a glass down on the table with perfect control and moved to the next guest. It was somewhere around the 40-minute mark, 40 minutes of this, 40 minutes of crystal and cruelty and the smell of camellia, that she felt a hand close briefly around her wrist. Light. Careful. A touch that knew it was not entirely welcome. She stopped. Hyun-woo was standing close to her, angled slightly so that his back was to the nearest group of guests. His face was doing the thing it did when he was managing something internal, jaw set, eyes careful, the particular stillness of a man trying to hold several things at once without dropping any of them. "Julie," he said quietly. Almost a whisper, she looked at him. Just looked. She had learned over 2 years of loving this man that silence was sometimes the most honest thing she could give him, because words between them had a way of becoming negotiations, and she was tired of negotiating the terms of her own dignity. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away first, which told her everything. "Please," he said lower. "Endure tonight. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Just please." She looked at his profile, the clean line of his jaw, the slight tension at his temple. The man who had married her in a courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon and cried, actually cried when she said yes. The man who made her tea when she studied late and learned 2 of her mother's Yoruba phrases just to make her laugh. The man who had, 40 minutes ago, handed her to his family like a piece of furniture and asked her to be grateful for the placement. Please endure tonight. Something shifted inside her. Not loudly. Not with drama. The way ice shifts before it breaks, a slow, structural thing, deep underneath the surface, where no one can see it happening until it's already done. She realized, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just stopped lying to herself, that this had not been an accident. This had not been fear in the moment, not a stumble under pressure, not a man overwhelmed by circumstance making a terrible reflex choice. The staff member at the entrance had not been surprised. Madame Kang had moved with the confidence of a woman operating inside a plan. Even the tray had appeared too quickly, too conveniently, already in her hands before she'd had a moment to think. He had arranged this, not cruelly maybe, not with hatred, perhaps with the specific cowardice of a man who loved someone privately but could not bear the cost of loving them publicly, who had found a way to have both his world and her, as long as she agreed to be invisible inside it. She set the tray down on the nearest surface. She straightened her back. She looked at Hyun-woo one more time, and when he finally turned to meet her eyes, what he found there was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the quiet, absolute withdrawal of a woman who has just decided to stop waiting for someone to choose her. "I heard you," she said. And she walked back into the room and she kept her face, and she endured the rest of the evening not for him but for herself. Because she had worn this dress and pinned these braids and come to this house with her whole chest open, and she would leave the same way she came in, head up, eyes clear, ivory. The drive back was silent in the way that only married people can be silent. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of things to say, but the loaded, pressurized silence of 2 people who have far too much to say and are each waiting to see who breaks first. Julie watched Seoul move past the window. The Han, the river catching city light. Street vendors folding up their carts. A young couple outside a convenience store sharing something from a paper bag, laughing at nothing, unbothered, unwitnessed, free. She watched them until the car turned and they disappeared, and she felt the loss of them like a small additional wound on top of all the others. Hyungwoo parked in the basement of their building and turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment before saying, "I know what you're thinking." "Do you?" she said, not a question. "Julie, don't." She said it softly. That was the thing, she wasn't shouting. She had no interest in shouting. Shouting would have made it easier for him, given him something to manage, something to respond to, a temperature he could negotiate with. What she was offering him was much harder than that. She was offering him the truth at room temperature. "Just don't start with my name like that, like you're about to explain something to me, like I'm someone who needs to be talked down." He was quiet. She got out of the car. Inside, she went to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and stood at the counter drinking it slowly, and he followed her in and stood near the doorway with his jacket still on and his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he felt guilty, made himself smaller, took up less space, as though shrinking could function as an apology. "I panicked," he said finally. She set the glass down. "You panicked." "The entrance, when the staff, I panicked. I didn't know what to say and it came out wrong, and by the time I realized what I'd said it was already Hyungwoo." Her voice was very calm. "I need you to stop." He stopped. "Need you to stop," she said again, "because I have been standing in that house for 3 hours being ordered around and laughed at and called pretty for a maid, and the only thing that kept me standing upright in that room was telling myself that maybe, it had been an accident, that maybe you had frozen. That maybe you were human and fallible and afraid and not." She paused, and the pause had weight, "not someone who planned it." The word planned landed in the kitchen between them like something dropped from a height. He didn't deny it immediately. That was the thing she would remember later, lying awake at 3 in the morning replaying the conversation with the specific cruelty of a mind that refuses to let you rest. He didn't deny it immediately. There was a delay, brief, barely a second, but she had spent 2 years learning the architecture of this man's silences, and she knew the difference between the silence of someone searching for words and the silence of someone deciding how much truth to release. "I thought," he began carefully, "that it would be easier to introduce you slowly, to let them get used to you being around before." "Before what?" she said. "Before you told them I was your wife." Another silence. Longer this time. "We are legally married," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, not because they weren't true, but because she had never had to say them like this before, like evidence, like an argument. "For 14 months. We signed papers. I have a ring I only wear in this apartment because you asked me to wait. I have been waiting, Hyungwoo. I have been so patient. And tonight you walked me into your mother's house and handed me a serving tray. I was going to tell them." "When?" Her voice finally cracked on that word, not into tears, but into something rawer than tears, something that had been compressed for a very long time. "When were you going to tell them?" "After another dinner. After another excuse. After she had ordered me around enough times that I felt small enough to fit into whatever space your family was willing to give me." He crossed the kitchen toward her and she took one step back, not dramatically, just one clean step, and the step stopped him completely. "Julie," he said, and now his voice was breaking too, but she had learned tonight that a man's breaking voice was not the same as a man's changed behavior, and she could not afford to confuse the two anymore. "Need to know something," she said. "I need you to tell me the truth, not the careful version, not the version where you were afraid and overwhelmed and it all just happened. The truth." He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. "I didn't know how to lose everything at once," he said finally, and his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "The company, my mother, the board's confidence, all of it was there were already conversations happening about whether I was fit to lead without someone the family considered appropriate. And I love you, I do, but I thought if I could just buy more time." "You thought you could keep me in a box," she said. "A secret compartment. Your real life here, your public life there. And when the two worlds had to exist in the same room, you chose which one of us got to be real." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. It was simply true. She went to bed before him that night and lay on her side facing the wall and listened to him move around the apartment, the fridge opening, the tap running, the long silence that meant he was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark the way he did when something was consuming him. She had found it endearing once, that habit. The image of him sitting alone with his thoughts at 2 in the morning, too honest to sleep. Now it just felt like another thing she had romanticized past its actual shape. She did not sleep for a long time. 3 days passed in a cold architecture of careful politeness. They shared the apartment the way people share a waiting room, present, functional, not unkind, but not together. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup for her without being asked, which she accepted without comment. She cooked on the second night and made enough for two without deciding to, and he sat across from her and they ate in the careful silence of two people performing normalcy for an audience of only themselves. On the fourth day, everything changed. Julie was in the study finishing a paper when she heard Hyun-woo's phone ring in the next room, and then his voice, low, controlled, but with an edge she recognized immediately, and then a single word, his mother's name, said in the tone that meant something had already happened and could not be undone. She came to the doorway. He was standing with his back to her, one hand pressed flat on the desk, phone to his ear. His shoulders had the rigid, braced quality of a man receiving a blow he had been expecting but had hoped would not come. She wasn't supposed to, he started and then stopped, listening. I understand. I'll come tonight. He lowered the phone and stood very still for a moment, and then he turned and saw Julie in the doorway, and his face did something complicated and painful. She found the marriage certificate, he said. Julie leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms and felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. Not fear, not devastation, but a strange, arriving calm, like the end of a very long-held breath. Then I suppose, she said quietly, there's nothing left to protect. Kang family home felt different the second time. Julie had not been invited, she had simply come, because the marriage was hers as much as his, and she would not wait in a secret apartment while her life was discussed without her. She had worn jeans and a simple black top, no performance, no ivory dress, no armor except herself. Madame Kang was waiting in the sitting room like a woman who had spent 70 years perfecting the specific art of occupying a room in a way that made everyone else feel they were trespassing in it. She looked at Julie with eyes that held no warmth, no cruelty, just the absolute impersonal assessment of someone who had decided the outcome before the conversation began. You trapped my son, she said, in Korean. Clearly, precisely, making sure each word arrived without ambiguity, Julie answered in Korean. Your son is a grown man who made a choice, twice. Once when he married me and once when he decided to hide it. Madame Kang's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. You came here with nothing, she said. I came here with a scholarship, a first-class academic record, and enough dignity to fill this room, Julie said. What I left with the last time I was here was the serving tray your staff handed me, which I'd like to return. Silence that followed was extraordinary. Even Hyun-woo, standing to Julie's left, had gone completely still. Madame Kang looked at her for a long time. Then she said, with the cold precision of a woman releasing a final verdict, this marriage will be dissolved. I will see to it personally. You will be compensated fairly and you will leave my son's life without disruption. Julie looked at her. Then she looked at Hyun-woo. He was looking at the floor. She waited. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough to be certain. He did not look up. And there it was, the final answer to the question she had been asking for 2 years, wearing different costumes, arriving in different rooms, but always the same question. When it costs you everything, will you choose me, the floor? He had chosen the floor. She picked up her bag. Have my lawyer contact yours, she said to Madame Kang. And then, to Hyun-woo, quietly, without bitterness, because she had decided that bitterness was a weight she was no longer willing to carry for someone else's cowardice. I hope the inheritance is worth it. She walked out of the Kang family home for the second and last time, and she did not look back, and the gate closed behind her with a sound like punctuation. The first thing she did was sleep. Not the restless, wall-facing half-sleep of the past several days, but real sleep, deep, total. The kind that arrives when the body finally accepts that the thing it had been bracing against has already happened, and there is nothing left to brace for. She slept for 11 hours in the small studio she rented in Mapo-gu, 3 subway stops from the apartment she had shared with Hyun-woo, and a world away from everything the Kang name represented. The studio had a single window that faced east, and when she woke the morning light was coming through it at a low, clean angle, falling across the floor in a long rectangle, and she lay there watching dust move through it and felt, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the slow-burning humiliation that would take much longer to fully process, something she had not felt in a very long time. Space. Room to be exactly who she was without measuring herself against what someone else needed her to be. She got up. She made tea. She opened her laptop and finished the paper she had abandoned 3 days earlier, and she submitted it at 9:30 in the morning. And then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of feeling everything. The love, the loss, the waste of it, the specific grief of losing not just a person but the version of yourself that existed inside that relationship. And then she got up and washed her face and began. The university became her structure. She had always been a strong student, but she had spent the last year managing the emotional labor of a secret marriage with the same energy she should have been pouring entirely into her work. And now that the secret was gone, now that there was nothing to manage and protect and carefully navigate, the clarity was almost shocking. Her supervisor noticed within 2 weeks, called her into his office and told her, with the mildly startled expression of a man recalibrating his expectations, that her recent chapter submission was the strongest writing she had produced in her entire program. She thanked him in Korean and walked out into the corridor, and stood there for a moment feeling the particular satisfaction of a woman who is finally running at full capacity. She moved through the city differently now. Seoul had always been beautiful to her, the way old and new existed inside each other without apology. The way the mountains sat behind the skyline on clear days like something permanent and unbothered. The way the streets changed personality block by block, tender and chaotic and alive. But she had spent 2 years experiencing it through the filter of someone else's world, always partly elsewhere, always partly in the waiting room of a life that was supposed to begin properly once Hyung-woo found his courage. Now she was simply here, present, hers. She started writing. Not academic writing, something else. She had kept a journal since she was 12 years old, a habit her mother had installed in her the way other mothers installed table manners or religious practice. Consistently, without explanation, as though the importance of it was self-evident. In Seoul, the journal had become a place to put the things she couldn't say out loud, the loneliness of the first winter, the strange exhilaration of navigating a city in a language she was still assembling, the texture of falling in love with someone whose world was so different from hers that loving him had sometimes felt like learning a second language. She began shaping these entries into something longer, something with a spine. She didn't know what it would become yet. She only knew that writing it felt like recovering a voice she hadn't realized she'd been lowering. The news broke on a Tuesday. She found out the way most people found out about things they were personally involved in, but had not been consulted about, through someone else's phone screen, thrust toward her face by her friend Yemi, a fellow international student from Abuja who had been Julie's closest confidant in Seoul, and who was now standing in the university cafeteria looking equal parts horrified and electrified. The headline read, "Kang heirs secret marriage to foreign student confirmed, family sources speak out." The article was the carefully managed kind, the sort that quotes anonymous family sources in language that manages to be sympathetic to the family while painting the other party as an ambiguity, a complication, a question mark in someone else's story. Julie's name was there. Her photograph, taken from her university profile without her knowledge, was there. The word foreign appeared 3 times in 4 paragraphs, doing the work that more explicit language apparently couldn't be trusted to do cleanly. She read it once, handed Yemi's phone back, and ate her lunch. "That's it," Yemi said. "That's your reaction. What would you like me to do?" Julie said. "I don't know, react, cry, call him something." Julie considered this. "I cried," she said. "I cried for approximately 1 hour in my studio 11 days ago. I scheduled it. It was thorough. I'm done." Yemi stared at her for a long moment and then said, with deep sincerity, "You are the most terrifying person I have ever met." And Julie laughed genuinely, fully, the first real laugh in weeks, and the laugh surprised her with its own completeness, with how much of herself was still inside it. The public reaction was not what the Kang family had anticipated. Whatever narrative the article had been designed to produce, the audience had apparently not received the memo. The comments arrived in waves. First, the expected mixture of curiosity and judgment, the predictable division of opinion that any story involving a wealthy family and a foreign woman would generate. But underneath it, gaining momentum with the quiet persistence of something true, a different current. People who had been foreign students in Korean universities. People who had married into families that treated them as embarrassments. People who had been handed serving trays in rooms they had every right to stand in with their heads up, They recognized the story. They had lived versions of it. She carried that tray with more dignity than anyone in that room deserved. One comment read, and had been shared 40,000 times by the following morning. Julie did not read the comments. She had made a deliberate decision about that, not out of fragility, but out of self-preservation. Her story was hers. What the internet chose to do with it was a separate thing that she would not allow to become the lens through which she processed her own experience. But Yemi read them. Yemi read all of them, and reported back with the thorough dedication of a woman who had appointed herself unofficial press secretary. And so Julie knew, in the abstract, at a safe distance, that the tide had shifted. It was 6 weeks after the article that Hyun-woo called. She almost didn't answer. She stood in her studio with her phone in her hand, watching his name on the screen, and felt the complicated, unwelcome tug of it. Not love exactly, not anymore, but the residue of love, the ghost of the feeling that lingers in the walls of a place long after the thing itself has left. She answered because she had decided she was not a woman who avoided difficult things. She had always walked toward them. That was not going to change because of him. Julie. His voice was different, stripped of something. The careful arrangement was gone. Hyun-woo, she said. I called a press conference, he said. Yesterday, he paused. I told them the truth, all of it, the marriage, what I did at the dinner, what I asked you to endure, I said it publicly. She was quiet. Not calling because I expect anything, he said quickly. I'm not calling to ask you to, I just needed you to hear it from me, that I said it, that I told them I was the one who was wrong. That I said the person who should be ashamed is me. His voice broke cleanly on the last word, and she believed it, which was almost worse than if she hadn't. I'm sorry, Julie. Not for the divorce, that's yours and I won't fight it, but for what I did to you in that house, for what I asked you to be. You deserve to walk into that room as my wife and I was too afraid, and I will carry that. She sat down on the edge of her bed. Outside her single east-facing window, Seoul was doing what Seoul did, moving, layering, living, entirely indifferent to the small, enormous things happening inside its buildings. A motorcycle somewhere below. A child's voice from a neighboring window, the city breathing. I know you're sorry, she said finally. I believe you. Then that's not enough, she said, not unkindly, not with bitterness. Simply as a fact, the way you state the weather or the time. It's not enough, Hyun-woo, not for me. Maybe for someone else, maybe in a different life. But I spent 2 years making myself smaller to fit into the space your fear allowed me, and I am not small. I was never small. And I need to spend the next part of my life remembering that in a room where no one is asking me to forget it. A long silence. I know, he said. And the way he said it told her that he did, fully, finally, without negotiation. Take care of yourself, she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her studio. And then she opened her laptop and went back to her writing. And the words came the way they always came when she was most fully herself, cleanly, and with purpose, and without apology. She defended her thesis 8 months later on a Thursday morning in early spring, in a room full of people who had read her work and come specifically to hear her speak. She wore a deep green dress, not ivory, not armor, just a color she loved. And she stood at the front of the room and talked about identity and displacement, and the labor of existing with dignity in spaces not designed for you. And the room was so quiet you could hear the building settle around her voice. Her supervisor shook her hand afterward and said it was the finest defense he had witnessed in 11 years. She called her mother that evening, standing outside the university building in the spring air, and her mother listened to everything, the defense, the grade, the months before it, all of it. The parts Julie had protected her from while they were happening. And when Julie finished, her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, in Yoruba, the thing she had always said when Julie was small and the world had been unkind. You are you. Nothing that happens to you changes what you are. Julie stood on the pavement in the spring air of a city that had cost her something real and given her something realer. And she felt the truth of it move through her like a clean note held for a long time. She was still here, still whole. Still hers. The ivory dress was folded in a box in her studio closet. She had kept it not as a wound, not as a reminder of humiliation, but because she had worn it with her full chest open and her mother's earrings and her practiced Korean and her whole honest self. And no one, not Madame Kang, not the woman who called her pretty for a maid, not even the man she had loved and married and lost, could take the dignity of that from her. She had walked into that house as herself. She had walked out the same way. And everything that came after, the thesis, the writing, the spring air, the city, the life assembling itself around her at full volume, was simply proof of what her mother had always known, and what Julie Ackhafer had spent one very long, very expensive year remembering. You cannot diminish a woman who knows exactly who she is. You can only reveal yourself in the attempt.
Hi, lovelies. So this is where this story ends. Seriously, I can't thank you guys enough. Your support has been immense, has been so crazy, like, and has kept this channel running. Thank you so much for the love, for the subscription, for the likes, for the comments, for everything. See you guys on the next one. Love you all.